The road to Silverbrook wound through a forest of twisted pines, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers across the cracked asphalt. Eve Marshall, a 28-year-old photographer known for capturing images of forgotten places, gripped the steering wheel of her beaten-up Volkswagen. She was chasing whispers of the Mirror House, an old mansion with walls lined with mirrors that showed more than simple reflections. As dusk fell, Eve entered Silverbrook, a dying town of sagging buildings and boarded-up storefronts. She checked into a rundown motel, where the wizened old woman at the desk eyed her with suspicion. "You're here for the house, aren't you?" the woman croaked. "They all come for the house, thinking they'll be the ones to unlock its secrets to tame it." She shook her head. "Fools, the lot of you." Eve took the key to room 13, the old woman's warning echoing in her mind. "Whatever you think you're looking for in that house, it ain't worth finding. Some doors are better left closed." That night, Eve's sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of endless corridors lined with mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of herself. In one nightmare, she saw herself trapped behind the glass, pounding silently as another Eve, with eyes that gleamed with malevolent intelligence, walked away wearing her life like an ill-fitting suit. The next morning, Eve found herself in the town's only diner, where her inquiries about the Mirror House were met with fear and hostility. The waitress, Doris, warned her bluntly, "That house ain't just interesting. It's dangerous. Folk go in there, they don't come out the same if they come out at all." As Eve contemplated this, the local sheriff, Tom Grady, approached her. His weathered face bore the weight of unspoken stories as he shared his own experiences with the house. "We've had incidents over the years," he said, his eyes distant. "People going missing, others coming back changed. My deputy, few years back, good kid, smart, went out there on a dare, came back, different. Quit the force a week later, moved away without so much as a goodbye." Despite the warnings, Eve's curiosity only grew. She'd come to Silverbrook for a story, and she wasn't leaving without it, no matter the cost. As she loaded her gear into her car, Eve caught sight of her reflection in the window. For a split second, she could have sworn she saw something move behind her, a dark shape that vanished as soon as she turned to look. The drive to the Calder mansion was tense, the trees seeming to close in around her. When the house finally came into view, Eve's breath caught in her throat. It loomed before her, a behemoth of Victorian architecture gone to seed. Turrets and gables rose against the sky, their once proud lines now sagging with neglect. Ivy crept up the weathered stone walls, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the structure. But it was the windows that truly captured Eve's attention. Even from a distance, she could see that they were wrong somehow. They didn't reflect the morning light as they should. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, each pane a void that threatened to pull in anything that gazed too long. With a deep breath, Eve approached the front door. The worn brass doorknob felt cold beneath her fingers, almost seeming to pulse with an otherworldly energy. She hesitated for a moment, the warnings of the townspeople echoing in her mind. But her curiosity and determination won out. With a turn of the knob and a push, the door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely beyond. Eve stepped over the threshold, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she found herself in a grand foyer, its once opulent furnishings now covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was the mirrors that immediately drew her attention. They were everywhere, covering the walls, standing in ornate frames, even affixed to the ceiling. Each one seemed to ripple slightly, as if the glass was not quite solid. Eve raised her camera, focusing on the nearest mirror, but when she looked through the viewfinder, she gasped. The reflection showed not the dusty, abandoned interior, but a room full of life and light, with figures moving just out of focus. She lowered the camera, blinking in confusion. The mirror now showed only her own bewildered face, surrounded by the decaying splendor of the house. Eve shook her head, trying to clear it. "Just a trick of the light," she muttered, but she couldn't quite convince herself. As she moved deeper into the house, Eve felt a strange pull, as if the mirrors were calling to her. Each room she entered was more disorienting than the last, with mirrors placed at odd angles, creating a maze-like effect. She found herself losing track of which reflections were real and which were merely echoes of echoes. In what must have once been a ballroom, Eve encountered a mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling, its surface dark and cloudy. As she approached, her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, as if struggling to keep up. Eve reached out, her fingertips nearly touching the glass. Suddenly, her reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down Eve's spine. She jerked her hand back, but not before feeling a cold, electric shock run through her body. The room seemed to spin around her, and for a moment, Eve could have sworn she saw other versions of herself in the peripheral mirrors, each one wearing a different expression: fear, anger, ecstasy, despair. Eve staggered back, her heart racing. She raised her camera like a shield, snapping photos frantically, hoping to capture what she was seeing. But with each click of the shutter, the visions in the mirrors seemed to shift and change, always just out of focus, always just beyond her ability to definitively capture. As she moved from room to room, Eve began to lose track of time. The house seemed to stretch and contract around her, hallways lengthening impossibly, doors leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. And always, there were the mirrors, showing glimpses of other lives, other possibilities. In one mirror, Eve saw herself accepting a prestigious award, her photographs displayed in a grand gallery. In another, she was broken and destitute, her camera in pieces at her feet. Each reflection seemed to whisper to her, offering promises or threats, temptations or warnings. Eve found herself drawn to a particular mirror, ornately framed in tarnished silver. As she gazed into it, the reflection rippled, and she saw herself as she'd always dreamed of being: confident, successful, admired. The reflection beckoned to her, its eyes alight with an inner fire that Eve had always felt was missing in herself. "This could be you," a voice whispered, though Eve couldn't tell if it was in her head or coming from the mirror itself. "All you have to do is step through. Leave behind your doubts, your fears. Become who you were meant to be." Eve's hand reached out almost of its own accord, her fingertips brushing the cool surface of the mirror. It yielded like water, rippling around her touch. For a moment she felt a pull, an urge to step forward, to embrace the version of herself she saw in the reflection. But then she remembered the sheriff's warning. Don't trust what you see in the mirrors, no matter how real it looks, no matter how much you want it to be true. It's not. With a supreme effort of will, Eve wrenched her hand back. The mirror seemed to protest, its surface roiling angrily. Eve stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She realized with a start that tears were streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when she'd started crying. As she tried to collect herself, Eve became aware of a presence behind her. She spun around, her camera raised defensively, but there was no one there, just another mirror, this one cracked and tarnished. But in its fractured surface, Eve caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. It was herself, but not herself. The figure in the mirror wore her face like an ill-fitting mask, its eyes empty and hungry. It reached out, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Eve screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house. She turned and ran, no longer caring about the story, no longer thinking about anything but escape. She stumbled through hallways that seemed to shift and change, past mirrors that flashed with images too terrible to comprehend. Finally, mercifully, she saw the front door. Eve burst through it, gasping in the fresh air as if she'd been underwater. She ran to her car, fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them into the ignition. As she peeled out of the driveway, Eve glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the doorway of the house watching her go. But it wasn't her reflection this time. It was something else, something that wore the face of Edwin Calder, the house's long-dead owner. It smiled at her, a knowing, triumphant smile that seemed to say, "You'll be back. They always come back." Eve drove away from Silverbrook as fast as she dared, her mind reeling from what she'd experienced. She knew she should feel relieved to have escaped, but there was a part of her, a small, insistent part, that longed to turn around. To go back to the house and its promises of other lives, other selves. As the town faded in her rearview mirror, Eve couldn't shake the feeling that she'd left something behind in that house of mirrors. Something important, something vital. And in the deepest, darkest corner of her mind, a voice whispered that someday, somehow, she would return to claim it. For now, though, Eve Marshall drove on into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the mirror house and its impossible reflections. But even as the miles stretched between her and Silverbrook, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the story wasn't over, that it had in fact only just begun. The weeks following Eve Marshall's harrowing experience at the mirror house passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. She'd returned to her small apartment in the city, but found no comfort in its familiar surroundings. Every reflective surface seemed to mock her, hiding potential horrors just beyond her perception. Her photographs from the house had all come out wrong, blurred, distorted, or showing impossible scenes that Eve knew she hadn't captured. In one, she could swear she saw a figure standing behind her, its features indistinct, but its posture menacing. In another, the grand staircase of the foyer twisted into an Escher-like nightmare of endless steps and impossible angles. Eve's editor, Jim, had been less than pleased with her lack of usable material. "Marshall," he'd growled over the phone, "you're one of my best. What the hell happened out there?" She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Who would believe her? Instead, she mumbled excuses about equipment malfunctions and poor lighting conditions. Jim had sighed, his disappointment palpable even through the phone line. "Take some time off," he'd said finally. "Get your head straight, then bring me something I can use." But Eve couldn't let it go. The mirror house had sunk its hooks into her psyche, and she found herself obsessively researching its history, trying to make sense of what she'd experienced. Edwin Calder, she learned, had been more than just an eccentric artist. He'd been a student of the occult, fascinated by the idea of parallel realities and the malleability of consciousness. His experiments with mirrors had started innocently enough, attempts to capture different aspects of the human psyche through reflected images, but as Eve dug deeper, she uncovered darker rumors. Whispers of rituals performed in the dead of night, of volunteers who entered the house and were never seen again. And always at the center of it all were the mirrors. Portals, some said, to other worlds, other possibilities. One night, unable to sleep, Eve found herself staring at her own reflection in her bathroom mirror. For a moment, just the briefest instant, she thought she saw it change. Saw herself as she might have been if she'd made different choices, taken different paths. The vision was gone in a blink, but it left Eve shaken. Was she losing her mind? Or had her experience in the mirror house awakened something in her, some latent ability to perceive these other realities? She needed answers, and she knew there was only one place she could find them. Despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away, Eve found herself packing her bags, loading up her car, and heading back to Silverbrook. The town seemed even more desolate than before, if that was possible. As Eve drove down the main street, she noticed more boarded-up windows, more for sale signs and dusty storefronts. It was as if the very life was being slowly drained from the place. She pulled up to the same rundown motel, steeling herself for another confrontation with the suspicious old woman at the desk. But when she entered the office, she found someone else entirely. A young man, probably in his early 20s, with a shock of unkempt dark hair and eyes that seemed too old for his face. "Welcome to the Silverbrook Inn," he said, his voice flat and uninflected. "How can I help you?" Eve hesitated, then asked for a room. As the young man, his name tag read Michael, processed her information, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and his eyes never quite seemed to focus on her. "You're back," Michael said suddenly as he handed her the key to room 13, the same room she'd stayed in before. Eve startled. "I'm sorry? You were here before you went to the house." It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" Eve asked, a chill running down her spine. Michael's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Everyone knows. The house, it changes you, marks you. Once you've been there, you're never quite the same. Before Eve could respond, Michael turned away, effectively dismissing her. She retreated to her room, her mind racing. What did he mean the house marked her? And how had he known she'd been there before? Sleep eluded her that night. Eve tossed and turned, her dreams a kaleidoscope of fractured reflections and distorted faces. She woke with a start in the early hours of the morning, her heart pounding, certain she'd heard someone whispering her name. The next day, Eve decided to visit the local library, hoping to find more information about Edwin Calder and the history of the Mirror House. The librarian, an elderly woman with thick glasses and a perpetual frown, eyed her suspiciously as she asked about local history books. "Why do you want to know about that place?" the librarian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a photographer," Eve explained, falling back on her usual cover story. "I'm doing a piece on historic homes in the area." The librarian's frown deepened. "That's what the last one said too, poor boy. He never did come back to return his books." A chill ran down Eve's spine. "What do you mean? What happened to him?" The old woman shook her head. "No one knows for sure. He went up to that house just like you're planning to do. A week later, someone fitting his description was seen boarding a bus out of town. But it wasn't him. Not really." "What do you mean, not really?" Eve pressed. The librarian leaned in close, her roomy eyes intense behind her thick lenses. "It looked like him, sure. Sounded like him too, they say. But the eyes were all wrong. Empty. Like something else was wearing his skin." Eve felt her blood run cold, remembering the figure she'd seen in the cracked mirror, the one wearing her face like an ill-fitting mask. "Do you know anything about Edwin Calder?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The man who built the house?" The librarian's expression darkened further. "Calder was a madman," she spat, meddling with forces he couldn't hope to control. They say he found a way to travel between worlds, to step into the lives of his other selves. But there's always a price for that kind of power." She turned away, rummaging through a drawer behind her desk. After a moment, she produced a thin, leather-bound volume. "This was Calder's journal," she said, holding it out to Eve. "Or part of it, anyway. Most of his writings were destroyed after what happened. But this survived." Eve took the journal with trembling hands. "What did happen?" she asked. The librarian's eyes seemed to cloud over, as if she was looking at something far away. "No one knows for sure," she said softly. "But they say that one night, Calder's experiments went too far, that he opened a door that should have stayed closed. And something came through." Eve spent the rest of the day poring over Calder's journal, her sense of unease growing with each page she turned. The man's writings were a mix of scientific notation, esoteric symbolism, and increasingly unhinged ramblings about the nature of reality and consciousness. One passage near the end of the journal stood out. "The mirrors are more than mere reflectors of light. They are windows, no, doors to infinite possibilities. With the right focus, the right ritual, one can step through and become any version of oneself. But beware. The reflections have desires of their own. And for every self that steps through, another must take its place." As night fell, Eve found herself drawn once again to the Mirror House. She knew it was foolish, knew she should run as far and as fast as she could. But the promise of answers, of understanding what had happened to her and why she felt so changed, was too powerful to resist. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and hungry in the gathering gloom. Eve took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. With Calder's journal clutched tightly to her chest like a talisman, she approached the front door. This time it swung open at her touch, as if the house had been waiting for her return. As Eve stepped over the threshold, she could have sworn she heard a soft, satisfied sigh, as if the house itself was welcoming her home. The mirrors seemed to shimmer in the darkness, their surfaces rippling with barely contained energy. Eve's reflections watched her from every angle, some smiling, some weeping, all beckoning her deeper into the house's impossible geometry. She knew she should be afraid. Part of her was terrified, but another part, a part that felt older, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous, whispered that she was exactly where she needed to be. Eve Marshall, or whatever she was becoming, moved deeper into the mirror house. The door swung shut behind her with a soft, final click. And in every reflection, in every fractured pane of glass, something smiled. The deeper Eve ventured into the mirror house, the more she felt herself unraveling. Reality seemed to bend and warp around her, the laws of physics becoming mere suggestions in this place where reflections held more truth than the tangible world. Calder's journal clutched tightly in her hands. Eve navigated the twisting corridors, each turn revealing new impossibilities. Rooms that couldn't exist, staircases that led to nowhere and everywhere at once, and always the mirrors, watching, waiting, whispering. In one room, Eve found herself surrounded by hundreds of versions of herself, each reflection showing a different path her life could have taken. She saw herself as a renowned war photographer, bruised and battered, but eyes alight with purpose. Another Eve was a mother, cradling a child with her eyes and smile. Yet another was broken, huddled in a corner, her camera smashed at her feet. "Choose," the reflection seemed to whisper. "Step through. Become." Eve's head swam with the possibilities, the temptation to simply let go and fall into one of these other lives almost overwhelming. But she gritted her teeth, remembering why she had come. She needed answers, not escape. Eve approached it cautiously, her reflection wavering and distorting as she drew near. But it wasn't her reflection that finally came into focus in the mirror's depths. It was Edwin Calder himself. He looked much as he did in the old photographs Eve had seen, a distinguished man with piercing eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. But there was something wrong about him, something that made Eve's skin crawl. His edges seemed blurred, as if he wasn't quite solid, and his eyes were windows into a void that threatened to swallow her whole. "Welcome back, Eve Marshall," Calder's reflection spoke, his voice echoing strangely as if coming from a great distance. Or should I say, welcome home. Eve swallowed hard, fighting down her terror. "What is this place?" and she demanded. "What have you done?" Calder's laugh was hollow, devoid of any real mirth. "This place. This is the culmination of my life's work. A nexus of realities. A place where the barriers between worlds have worn thin." His eyes gleamed with a fanatic light. "As for what I've done, I've opened the door, my dear. I've shown us all what we truly are. Infinite, eternal, unbounded by the limitations of a single reality." "But the cost," Eve said, thinking of the missing people, the changed deputy, the hollow-eyed Michael at the motel. "What about those who've been lost?" "Lost?" Calder scoffed. "They're not lost. They're free. Free to explore every possibility, every version of themselves. Some find a reality they prefer and stay. Others," his smile turned cruel, "others become something more, something hungry." A chill ran down Eve's spine as she remembered the thing she'd seen wearing her face, its eyes empty and ravenous. "What do you mean, hungry? Surely you felt it," Calder said, his voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "The pull of other lives, other selves. The desire to step through, to become something more. But nature abhors a vacuum, my dear. For every self that steps through, another must take its place, and some develop a taste for it. They become collectors of selves, jumping from reality to reality, always seeking, always consuming." Eve's mind reeled with the implications. "Is that what happened to you?" she asked. "Are you one of these collectors?" Calder's laugh this time was bitter. "Oh no, my dear, I'm something far worse. I'm the door itself." His form seemed to ripple and distort in the mirror. "I opened the way between worlds, and in doing so, I became the way. I am everywhere and nowhere, in every reflection, every possibility. I am the house, and the house is me." As if in response to his words, the entire house seemed to shudder. The mirrors around Eve came to life, each one showing a different version of Calder, a different facet of his fractured psyche. "But you, Eve Marshall," Calder continued, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "You're different. You've touched the other side and returned. You've seen the infinite and maintained your sense of self. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" Eve took a step back, suddenly aware of the danger she was in. "What do you want from me?" "Want?" Calder's smile was terrible to behold. "I want you to join me, Eve. To become like me. A nexus of realities. A being of infinite possibility. Together, we could be gods." The mirrors around them pulsed with energy, and Eve felt a pull unlike anything she'd experienced before. It was as if every fiber of her being was being drawn towards Calder, towards the promise of power and knowledge beyond imagining. For a moment, just a moment, she was tempted. The part of her that had always sought the truth, that had driven her to capture the hidden stories of the world, yearned to accept, to know everything, to be everything. It was intoxicating. But then she thought of the hollow-eyed people she'd seen, the lost souls consumed by the house's hunger. She thought of her own reflection, pounding silently on the glass, trapped and desperate. "No," Eve said, her voice stronger than she felt. "No, I won't become like you. I choose this reality, this self. It might not be perfect, but it's mine." Calder's face contorted with rage. "You fool!" he snarled. "You have no idea what you're rejecting. The power, the knowledge." "Is not worth the cost," Eve interrupted. She held up Calder's journal. "You wrote it yourself. The reflections have desires of their own. You're not in control here, are you? You're as much a prisoner as anyone else." The house shuddered again, more violently this time. Cracks began to appear in the mirrors around them, and through those cracks, Eve caught glimpses of other places, other worlds, some beautiful, some terrifying, all hungry. "You've opened Pandora's box," Eve realized aloud, "and now you can't close it." Calder's form was beginning to dissolve, his edges blurring into the mirror itself. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his voice fading. "I've seen eternity. I've become eternity. Please, Eve, don't let it end like this. Join me. Help me. Save me." Eve felt a pang of pity for the man Calder had once been, but she steeled herself against it. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I can't save you. I can only save myself." With that, she turned and ran. The house erupted into chaos around her, mirrors shattering, reality itself seeming to splinter and crack. Eve dodged falling debris and leapt over suddenly appearing chasms, her photographer's instincts guiding her through the madness. Behind her, she could hear Calder's voice. Or was it the voice of the house itself, howling in anguish and rage? The walls bulged and twisted, trying to trap her, to draw her back. But Eve pressed on, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, mercifully, she saw the front door. It seemed to waver and shift, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. But Eve focused on it with every ounce of her will, every shred of her desire to remain herself. With a final burst of speed, she reached the door and yanked it open. The night air hit her like a physical force, clean and real and blessedly normal. Eve stumbled down the steps and across the overgrown lawn, not daring to look back until she reached her car. When she finally turned, the sight nearly stopped her heart. The mirror house was dissolving. Its walls ran like melting wax, its windows blazed with otherworldly light. And in every pane of glass, every reflective surface, Eve could see faces, hundreds, thousands of faces, all screaming silently as they were drawn back into whatever hell Calder had opened. Eve jumped into her car and peeled away, her tires kicking up gravel. In her rearview mirror, she watched as the house collapsed in on itself, imploding with a silent flash that lit up the night sky. And then it was gone. Where the mirror house had stood was nothing but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and strewn with debris. It was as if the house had never existed at all. Eve drove through the night, putting as much distance between herself and Silverbrook as she could. Her mind whirled with everything she'd seen and learned, struggling to process the impossible. As dawn broke, Eve finally pulled over at a rest stop. She got out of the car on shaky legs and made her way to the bathroom. For a long moment, she stood before the mirror, almost afraid to look. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and drawn but undeniably her own. No other selves peered out from behind her eyes. No hungry void waited to swallow her. She was just Eve Marshall, photographer and seeker of truths, scarred but intact. As she walked back to her car, Eve realized she was still clutching Calder's journal. She thought about throwing it away, about trying to forget everything that had happened. But she knew she couldn't. The story of the mirror house, of Edwin Calder's hubris and fall, needed to be told. Eve Marshall got back in her car and started the engine. She had a story to write, a warning to give to the world. And as she pulled back onto the highway, heading towards home and whatever future awaited her, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. She had faced the infinite and returned. She had seen the darkest reflections of herself and rejected them. Whatever came next, Eve knew she could face it. After all, it couldn't be any stranger than what she'd already seen.